On today's crossover edition of Locked On Blackhawks and Locked On Predators, we'll talk about why the heck these two hockey teams are so darn bad.
You are Locked On NHL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Blackhawks and Locked On Predators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we get into the good stuff, got to let you all know today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Go and download the Game Time app and use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps to get $20 off with your first purchase. I'm Jack Bushman, host of Locked On Blackhawks, joined by one half of the Locked On Predators podcast, Emma Lingan. Emma, believe it or not, this is only the second matchup between the Hawks and the Preds so far this year, and the first was all the way back on October 25th, prior to Halloween. I wish it was some better vibes to kick off this conversation and have our first chat since we've talked in a while. Two of the three worst teams in the NHL standings right now, Blackhawks dead last, Predators third to last. I figure we'd start off with a conversation around the Predators because I don't think too many people are quite surprised the Blackhawks are at the bottom of the standings once again. The same cannot be said about your Nashville Predators, and I'm sure, like myself, there are many Blackhawks fans out there wondering what the heck has gone wrong with this Nashville Predators team after what I thought was the most notable offseason in franchise history. Emma, what has gone wrong in Nashville so far in the first half of the season?
Yeah, join the club. We're all trying to figure that out. I think even the players too. It's really just been mystifying, honestly. I mean, they are coming off a big win over the Vegas Golden Knights on Tuesday. That was big for them. But again, it seems like a lot of even the wins that they've had have been mystifying. Like I said, Vegas, best team in the West. They beat Dallas. They beat Colorado. They beat Winnipeg. They beat LA. Like all teams that you would think would be unbeatable, but then they can't hang against teams like Montreal, Ottawa, etc. So it's really just been mystifying. And, you know, we over at Locked On Predators, we said all summer that, you know what, these big pieces, they're new, these are guys that you kind of build a system around. So let's give it some time. It's not going to gel right away. But when we said that, we were thinking maybe like a month and not, the entire first half of the season. It's really just kind of I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's been a lot of, at first it felt like a chemistry issue, and that's something that you only time can fix that, right? So I think that you're starting to see a little bit more of the chemistry now. Now you're starting to see more of what the Predators dealt with during the first half of last season, which was they're out shooting, out chancing their opponents, but the results just aren't there. And that's what's so baffling about it, and arguably even more frustrating about it.
Well, talk to me about some of the new pieces that have come on to this team this year. And you talked about in the first half of the year, you can maybe blame some of the inconsistency issues due to trying to establish that chemistry when you have new players like Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault, you bring in Brady Shea on the back end to join Roman Josi. Has it been those guys not living up to the expectations? Has it been them not meshing well, or has it been the depth guys who have really not lived up to par? Has it just been a kind of combination of everything, unfortunately?
It has just kind of been a perfect storm. Early on, it was the new guys, especially Stamkos. Took him a while to kind of get going, but he's going now. Jonathan Marchessault now leads the team in goals, so he's getting going now. It really kind of picked up ever since Stamkos moved to center. Marchessault's on the wing, and then Philip Forsberg is on the other wing on that top line now. So once that line combination started to gel, it was funny because that's when Stamkos and Marchessault started going, but then Philip Forsberg went ice cold and he went on a career-long 18-game goal drought where he didn't score a goal, but he was still racking up the assists because Marchessault and Stamkos were scoring. So it was like, seriously, can we not get everything to go right at one time? And, I think that now Forsberg is back to being Forsberg. He's got goals in 3 straight games. But then you look at even like I will be honest, I'm a little surprised at Brady Shea. He has been kind of the slowest, I think, to adapt and catch up into this system. And part of that, I think, is not it's out of his control because there's been a lot of movement on the back end. Guys like Dante Fabro leaving, he got put on waivers and picked up by Columbus. And then you've got guys like Adam Wilsby, Jeremy Lauzon are both on IR right now. Roman Yossi was injured for a while. So there's been a lot of moving parts back there. So you can't put it all on him, but it definitely, he's been the one that's maybe been a little bit slower to catch up as these new guys go.
One thing I wanted to ask you as well before we wrap things up and transition over to Blackhawks topics during segment 2, I was a part of the first NHL squad show that we actually just dropped earlier this afternoon. To everyone who's tuning into this episode, make sure to go and check out the very first Locked On NHL squad show. One of the big topics that we talked about in that episode, Emma, was possibly the Nashville Predators making a move with the head coaching position. Andrew Brunette, has that been a topic that you and Ann have talked about on your show? And I'm just kind of curious your opinion on where Andrew Brunette and his job security lies at this point in time, because some of us are a little bit surprised that a move hasn't been made at this point.
Oh yeah, we talk about this frequently on Locked On Predators, but I will say that I feel like a lot of the fan base does not like what we have to say about it. Ann and I are team Bruno's not going anywhere, only because, I mean, a big part of it is, number one, this guy was a Jack Adams finalist last year. So I think that alone has earned him a full season beyond that to try and figure this out. Then you add in the fact that he's got these new guys, that he needs to work into the system. And then you add in the fact that this is Barry Trotz's guy who he handpicked when he still had John Hines under contract. He didn't need to go get a new coach, but he thought that this was the guy. This was what he wanted. And so, not saying that Barry couldn't admit a mistake, but I still think, I know when you're losing this much, it feels like it's been forever, but it really has not been that long for Andrew Brunette. And so I think at this point, a mid-season firing really doesn't do anything for this team. They kind of are where they are right now. Mathematically, technically, barely still alive in the playoff hunt. They have not been mathematically eliminated, but at this point, I don't see how a mid-season coaching change really moves the needle all that much. I mean, if you think about it too, these guys that we just talked about, Stamkos, Marchessault, Shea, and then Forsberg, Yossi, O'Reilly, all these guys are not on expiring contracts. So it's not like this is a do or die year for them. I just think that now, when we get to the off season, depending on how the rest of the season goes, we might be having a different conversation. But as of right now, I say Brunette's job is safe.
And to be fair, to anyone who believes Andrew Brunette should have been already fired, us Blackhawks fans on this side of things have kind of seen the repercussions of firing your head coach and not really generating much of a difference that you were hoping for. And I'm sure we'll touch on that during segment 2. We'll see what winds up going down for the Nashville Predators the rest of the way. As you mentioned, it feels disappointing because there were all those expectations, I'm sure, and it makes it feel like this losing first half has been a lot longer and a lot more frustrating, but Andrew Brunette has proven that he is a worthy coach in this league. It is just interesting considering coaches have been fired for less, and it's a what have you done for me lately type of league. So I was very interested to kind of get your insight on that and Andrew Brunette's status, as I'm sure lots of us Blackhawks fans were. Thank you for that, Emma. We greatly appreciate your insight. We'll turn things over and talk about the Chicago Blackhawks here in just a moment during segment 2. Real quick, though, I do got to talk to you all about Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast, easy? You just use Indeed, because when it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. So stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites, because Indeed Sponsored Jobs puts your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. I've been in a spot where you need the right hire, like yesterday. The pressure's on, and every day without the right person costs you a setback. That's exactly when Indeed Sponsored Jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates in an instant. And now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit by going to Indeed.com/locked-on. Again, that's Indeed.com/locked-on right now, and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this very podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, Indeed, is all you need. All right, back here on the Locked On Blackhawks and Locked On Predators podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, wanted to say thank you to everyone for making each of our shows your very first listen, here to start off your day. Now for your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast so that you can become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Steal and Flip. And you can easily find the link to Locked On Fantasy Hockey right now on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Segment 2, Emma, turning it over to you to ask about why the Chicago Blackhawks are once again the worst team in the NHL standings as we enter the second half of the regular season.
Yeah, well, let's start there. I think we talked about the coaching change earlier, so I want to come back to that for a second, because what, in your mind, what do you think? Because I think people are looking at teams like Boston or even Detroit more recently that have had these mid-season coaching changes and have had kind of a spark that has come from that. Now, however short-lived that spark may be, it was still a spark. And it seemed like Chicago has absolutely not had that. So wanted to get your thoughts on that. And, do you think that there's any kind of remorse on the part of the team for moving on so quickly, or what's kind of the general vibe there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dilemma, Emma, because I ultimately believe Luke Richardson was fired because obviously there weren't expectations for the Chicago Blackhawks team. So I'm sure from the outside it seemed a little bit wonky. The reason I believe he was fired, though, is because not only did the Chicago Blackhawks not take a step or not show signs of progress like they were going to take a step under Luke Richardson in what was his third year behind the Blackhawks bench, but also Connor Bedard really wasn't taking that step either. And there were a lot of people starting to be like, oh my gosh, is Connor Bedard a bust? Because his first 20, 25 games of the year were pretty lackluster, especially in the goal scoring department. He was really snake bitten, and just the overall way the Blackhawks were going about their offense, it wasn't sustainable. There was no upside there, and it felt like scoring 3 goals in one single game was a miracle. So ultimately, that's what cost Luke Richardson his job. And since Andrew Sorensen has stepped in as the interim, Bedard has woken up. He does have 17 points now in his last 15 games since Sorensen has stepped in. However, this Blackhawks team has definitely regressed defensively, and that was the one thing they really did have going for them under Luke Richardson, who's played over 1,500 games himself in the NHL as a grinded out, physical, defensive defenseman. Like, he knows what he's doing in his own zone, and the Blackhawks were quietly right around the midway point of the league on defense under Luke Richardson. And since he's been fired, they've taken a huge step back. So it's like, yes, Bedard has woken up, but the team looks honestly even worse. Like, they have more offensive upside, but defensively there's so many holes. And now it's like we don't have anyone in that room to go and kind of solve it. And the guys are getting really frustrated with the losing constantly and the same problems continuing to be the issue. So yeah, I don't know if firing Luke Richardson was the right decision. Hindsight's always 20/20, and at the time I understood why they did. I was a little bit surprised, though, because even though there were some people really wanting to see this Blackhawks team, like I said, take that step, again, there weren't those playoff aspirations, and Richardson's contract was coming up at the end of this year, so they also could have just let him go and made the decision at the end of this season. But ultimately, Kyle Davidson, the general manager, had seen enough to make the move during the midway point of the year. But yeah, the Blackhawks certainly did not get a very long interim head coaching bump. They did win 3 of their first 5 games under Sorensen, but they've dropped 11 of their past 16 ever since and still dead last in the standings.
Well, obviously, we talk about this all the time that the coach often becomes kind of the scapegoat for whatever problems arise with the team. That's why Andrew Brunette's name has come up in these conversations, and that's why Luke Richardson lost his job. But how much of, what the Blackhawks are dealing with, you think, it really falls on Kyle Davidson? Because I feel like, yes, you talk about Bedard and the offensive structure not working, and sure, that can be coaching, but how much of sort of the general issue is with Kyle Davidson? Because you get a generational talent like Bedard, you'd think you'd want to surround him with the right pieces. And how much of this do you think is Davidson not doing his job in surrounding Bedard with the right pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. And Kyle Davidson really hasn't had to deal with any of that since being a general manager, because these last 2 years for the Blackhawks, they were expected to be terrible. And the roster that they had, everyone knew they were going to be awful. But coming into this year, I mentioned on my podcast, this was the first year where Kyle Davidson, if he doesn't deliver, could really draw some criticism. And that's kind of what's happening here. And I've thought Davidson has done a really good job so far in this rebuild in terms of weaponizing the Blackhawks cap space. His draft picks, I think, have been good. In terms of taking on more late round picks and just stockpiling the prospect pool, he's done a good job in all of those areas. But it's been pretty clear this season that he kind of made some first time GM mistakes over the summer. And a guy like Tyler Bertuzzi, who he gave a 4-year contract to, a notorious slow starter, got off to a terrible start to his Blackhawks tenure, has since picked it up, but still, for the price that he's being paid, we need him to be ready to go right off the gate. Teuvo Teravainen signed on for nearly $5 million for 3 years. He hasn't been nearly consistent enough for the expectations. TJ Brody doesn't even look like he's an NHL caliber defenseman. Like, seriously, some of the worst analytics in all of hockey, and he got a 2-year deal at nearly $4 million. So I'm not going to go and completely bash Kyle Davidson and say he did a terrible job, because quite honestly, this is still, again, big picture, another year where it really doesn't matter in terms of wins or losses. And we honestly won't know what kind of a job Kyle Davidson has done as a general manager until all of these pieces that he's taken in the first and second round have stepped onto the scene. And that's still a couple years away. Most of them are still in college or in junior hockey. But no, definitely Kyle Davidson deserves his share of criticism for the Blackhawks not taking a step this year, because they had the cap space to go and do so, and they spent a decent amount of it, but Alec Martinez hasn't been healthy. I've mentioned TJ Brody. They've added a lot of aging guys that just haven't been able to provide a lot of value and make an impact in today's NHL when speed and skill kind of dominate the league, and we still don't have enough of that. So, yeah, I think rightly so, Emma. A lot of fingers are starting to get pointed towards Kyle Davidson, and he's going to have to do a better job moving forward for this Blackhawks team to get where they want to be.
Well, I think it's interesting. You talk about the sort of the mental impact of the losing. These guys are sick of losing. I mean, of course they are. They're professional athletes. They don't want to lose. But I think it's interesting talking about the difference. Like you said, the expectations for these two teams wildly different heading into this season. And so obviously for the Predators, a lot of this, it seems like, is mental. It's the frustration, the belief is still there in the room. This team is too good to be this bad. So they know that they have the talent and they believe in themselves, but it's human nature. You get frustrated when things keep not going your way. It's interesting with the Blackhawks, though, because, again, not to say that they would have gone into the season like, all right, well, let's put up another L and go get another, top 2 pick. But I think that you would think that maybe there's some sort of, you don't want to be satisfied with losing, right? You don't ever want to just be in a state of acceptance with that. But I was watching the Winter Classic between the Blackhawks and the Blues, and yeah, and just the post-game interviews with those guys. And like, again, I'm not expecting it to be all sunshine and smiles in that locker room, but I mean, even a guy like Connor Bedard, who you don't even, I think when you look at a guy like Steven Stamkos, done a lot of winning in his day, of course, he's going to be extra frustrated. But Connor Bedard, he's still young. He kind of knows like where he's at and where this organization is at. But how much of this mental toll do you think that all this losing has taken on this team?
It's not only just the players in the locker room who I know are frustrated. It's the fan base who are really starting to be pushed to the brink. And I don't know if you're aware of all the TV problems that the Blackhawks are having, but they're not on television in the Chicagoland area. You can only watch through the app. I don't really enjoy how they've gone about promoting games and creating a fun environment at the United Center the last few years. They've taken away giveaways for fans. Tickets are still expensive. And Chicago sports as a whole, we're just dying for a winner here. So it's like all across the board, it feels like something really has to change for the Blackhawks going into this offseason. And I feel like it's kind of been a little bit of a wake-up call this year. And it feels like there have even been some rumors following that Winter Classic that Kyle Davidson went into the locker room and told the team that he wasn't happy enough with the effort. And I think at that same point in time, there are going to be people looking up at Kyle Davidson saying, we're not happy enough with your efforts. So something's got to change because the vibe of this team in the locker room with the fan base, there's not a lot of interest in. You're going to push potentially people back into the dark days like they were in 2003, 2004 when, again, the Blackhawks weren't on television. Hopefully we won't get to that point, Emma, but yeah, it's tough times for the Blackhawks as this is the third first half in a row they've reached the midway point of the season and dead last in the NHL standings. We're going to turn things over and talk about what we could see these two teams doing at the upcoming trade deadline on March 7th here in just a moment. Stick with us. But first, real quick, I got to talk to you all about Game Time. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. And one of my favorite moments from last year was going to a concert. The energy and the excitement were absolutely unforgettable. And now Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets to your favorite live events with their new feature called Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time, searching through thousands of tickets. And I personally have used Game Time since I was back in high school, close to, sadly, 10 years ago at this point. Whether I was going down to Wrigley Field to catch Cubs games with my friends, going down to the UC to check out the Blackhawks, always make sure to check out Game Time first because it's the fastest, cheapest, and easiest way for you to purchase your tickets. Plus, I love how they provide views from every seat in the house, so you know exactly what to expect before you arrive and you make your purchase. Highly recommend you all go and download the Game Time app, and when you do, use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps to get $20 off with your first purchase. Yes, you heard me right. You can get $20 off to see the Blackhawks or the Predators before the season wraps up. All you got to do, download Game Time, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Game Time. All right, before we wrap things up, segment 3 here, figured with the trade deadline quietly approaching, both of these teams probably are going to have a say in the trade deadline as it doesn't look like they're going to be part of the playoff picture unless something drastic happens for the Nashville Predators, unless they have the second half that everyone thought they were going to have right off the rip. I figure we discuss what we can expect to see from these two teams come trade deadline time. Emma, what are kind of the vibes around this Nashville Predators team right now? Are they still trying to make things work? Are they potentially going to be sellers in your mind? What are the expectations whenever that March 7th deadline starts to get a little bit closer?
Yeah, well, of course, a lot of hockey left to be played between now and then. That will determine some of it. But really, at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot that can be done with this roster. There's a lot of trade protection on these contracts. Guys like Steven Stamkos, Philip Forsberg, Roman Josi, the guys that are, the kind of the big name guys that you would think would really be a needle mover in a trade. They're probably not going anywhere. And the one guy whose name has come up recently because of a report from Elliot Friedman is Ryan O'Reilly, because he actually doesn't have that trade protection in his contract. but the Predators are acting like he does. So I think that, and quite honestly, I think that's a good move. He is really, really important to this team on the ice, but more so off the ice. Barry Trotz's whole plan when he came in, he signed all of these guys, but didn't leverage any of the future when he did it. So he didn't part with any high draft picks or blue chip prospects. Yaroslav Askarov situation aside, that we could do a whole nother episode about that. But in general, the future was not leveraged much by all of these signings. So I think that his whole plan this whole time has been, we want to give these young guys, the guys in our system, time to develop, but we also, we don't want to rush them, but we also want to make sure that we have a space for them when they are ready. And so that's kind of where he's at with these moves and these things. And so when those young guys come up through the system, Ryan O'Reilly is the guy that he wants them learning from, because his motor just doesn't stop. He is work ethic unmatched. I've been covering hockey for a long time. I've never met anyone quite like Ryan O'Reilly in that regard. So really good guy to have in the locker room, really good leader. For me personally, I think if we're going to see anyone gone at the trade deadline for Nashville, I think Gus Nyquist should already have his bags packed. I love Gus, but I think that, you got to be realistic. He's turning 35 soon. He's in the final year of his contract. They weren't going to re-sign him. He doesn't have trade protection. However, he is a really skilled veteran forward. He can really kind of give a contender a real bump if they're trying to make a push into the playoffs. And he's a guy that I think that they could get something for. So I'm not expecting any drastic moves. I would say like they would quote unquote sell, but they're not selling big pieces. They're selling Gus Nyquist and guys like that. I would also look at on the back end, Jeremy Lauzon as a potential option. He does bring a lot of size and physicality that they really like, but he's got a really cheap contract, and the Predators, he's kind of become expendable with all the left-handed defensemen the Predators have coming up through their system. So he's another guy I might keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think Gustav Nyquist is definitely someone that, especially as a player that can kind of go up and down the lineup, I think definitely there will be intrigue for a guy like that to be added as a third-line mixer come trade deadline time. For the Blackhawks side of things, it's going to be really curious because I'm sure they would like to trade Taylor Hall and get some assets for him, but at a $6 million price tag, they're definitely going to have to eat some of that salary cap. And even then, I don't know what type of return they would be looking at and whether it would be worth moving Taylor Hall when trading him is only going to make your offense worse. And you're already the 30th ranked offense in the NHL. That's a piece taken away from Connor Bedard. And that's kind of like the mix and match of what the Blackhawks are going to do at this year's trade deadline. I envision they're probably going to shop a guy like Pat Maroon out of respect. I mean, he was willing to come and sign on a deal with Chicago in the offseason. Someone who's obviously been there and done that come the most crucial time of the year. So I'm sure there'll be intrigue from another team to add him. Alec Martinez is kind of in a similar boat. Veteran three-time Stanley Cup champion, could be interesting on the back end. Ryan Donato is really the one guy I think a lot of teams could come calling for. Currently the third leading scorer for the Blackhawks, second in goals this year, probably the most underappreciated member of this Blackhawks team. He can provide you with a little bit of everything. Second on the team in hits, despite not being the biggest guy. Goes to the dirty areas, good shoot first mentality, and is responsible on the defensive side of things. So Taylor Hall and Ryan Donato are probably the two pieces I'm interested in for the Blackhawks. But again, those are two of their top 5 leading scorers that are only going to make this offense worse. But what I will add is they're probably going to be having some guys step onto the scene from college whenever their year wraps up, and maybe some more help coming up from the Rockford Ice Hogs as well. So we've seen the Blackhawks been pretty active in the trade deadline each of the last couple of years. I would anticipate nothing to change in 2025. Emma, putting you on the spot before we get on out of here. I didn't tell you this before we recorded. What's your prediction for tomorrow's matchup in the second meeting between this Blackhawks and Predators team? And what's your prediction for a goal score? I'll give you mine as well at the end.
Okay, prediction like final score
final
or
score.
Just
Give me a final score prediction and your guess as to who's scoring a goal.
All right, I'm going to go 3-2 Nashville as the final. Goal scorer, I got to go with the hot hand, Philip Forsberg. He scores in bunches, and he's been, like I said, he's got goals in his last 3. So I'm going Forsberg.
Do you know if UC Saros is starting tomorrow night by chance?
I would imagine so, because Justus Onninen started against Vegas the other night. So I would imagine so. But
I hate to hear that, because I don't know if you know UC Saros's numbers against the Blackhawks, but go and look them up on StatMuse or whatever after you record this, because he's standing on his head every single time. Because that's the case, I will probably lean Nashville's way. I'll go 4-2 Preds, but I am going to predict that Lucas Reichel is going to find the back of the net for the first time in 7 games, pick up a point for the second consecutive game, although the Blackhawks are going to fall for the 4th game in a row. Emma, thank you so much for taking the time. I apologize again for getting us started a little bit later than usual, but thank you for bearing with me. Please let all of my Blackhawks listeners know where they can follow you and in Locked On Predators throughout the rest of the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for doing this with me. I can be found on Twitter at Emma_Lingan, and you can follow the show at LO_Predators.
Awesome. Yeah, no problem. Appreciate you joining me. To everyone who tuned in, thank you very much. For anyone on the Predator side of things, if you want to follow me on X, you can find me at Jack Bushman 2. You can find Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube or for free wherever you may listen to your podcast. Thanks again to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks and Locked On Predators your very first listen. Until next time, have a great rest of your day